Okay, this will be our final segment for this chapter, and technically it belongs in the gender and sexuality chapter of our textbook, but I wanted to make sure to cover it. Physical development that occurs in adolescence. You guys probably all remember going through puberty. So awesome, right? Everybody enjoyed that. Puberty is the word that we use for the process of achieving sexual maturation. It begins with a growth spurt. Here we have classic 7th grade, right? We've got probably like 12 or 13-year-old kids here. It's cute because he thinks that he's taller than she is, even though it's so obvious that he's not. Let's look at her body language. Oh, she's so happy to be taller than the boys in the room, isn't she? And then look at him. He's got such a boyish little face, and he's like, I'm still taller, right? Like I was in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. You know, all of a sudden 6th, 7th grade girls start passing the boys up. The average age of the growth spurt for boys is about 13, whereas for girls it's about 11. So all of a sudden girls shoot past boys. In fact, if we look at this chart with the boys being the blue line and the girls being the purple, boys were bigger than the girls on average all the way up until girls hit their growth spurt. All of a sudden, on average, girls shoot past the boys, and then ultimately the boys reach their growth spurt, and then we'll pass the girls and stay above them for the rest of their lives, on average. I'm like that girl in the photo there. In 7th grade, I shot up to 5'7", and all the boys around me were 5'4" if they were tall, and I proceeded to grow another couple of inches over the next couple of years. And I felt just like her. I would stand with a slouch. I tried to pretend like I wasn't that tall. I mean, it was very stressful, and didn't even occur to me that the boys felt bad about it as well. I just felt ginormous. Everybody's uncomfortable during that period of time, and it can mark us for the rest of our lives, right? Now, what is actually going on in puberty? Well, the job of puberty is to establish the primary sexual characteristics. These are the changes that are going to have to occur to the reproductive organs and the external genitalia in order to become reproductively capable. So here we have some naked see-through people. On the left, you can see the woman has lines pointing at, for example, her ovaries. One of the things that will happen with primary sexual characteristics is that her ovaries will start to ripen an egg every month. As a result, she's going to start menstruating and becomes capable of conceiving a baby, right? So her uterus needs to grow larger. She'll start having a monthly menstrual cycle. A lot of this is governed by the functioning of the adrenal glands, but it's also governed by hormones that are being released by the pituitary gland in the brain. Now, if we switch over to the male side, his testicles are going to start to produce sperm. His penis and his testes are going to get much larger. In my lifespan development class, I have this really cool set of beads that kind of show you how the volume of the testes change over time, and a lot of growth that's going on during adolescence because those testes are going to start producing sperm. And then he's going to have the beginning of ejaculation. For girls, menarche is about age 12, her first period. About age 12. Girls tend to be very aware of how old they were when they got their first period. In my human sexuality class, I ask students to write about their first period. Girls, I ask them to post about that. And girls have very vivid recollections of their first periods. As I mentioned earlier in a previous segment, menarche is occurring earlier and earlier. It's what we call a secular trend, when you can really see the changes across several generations. So that, yeah, if you compare a girl to her mom, you might not really notice a difference in the age of menarche. But if you compare a girl to her 2 times great-grandmother, all of a sudden it becomes really clear that she's menstruating much earlier than her grandmother did. A lot of people are curious why. We always want to know why. One of the lures of pseudoscientific thinking is to think that there is a reason why. I've had students in class tell me it's because there are hormones in our food. That's the reason. Well, that's not the reason. It may be part of a reason, but it's not the reason. There are multitudes of factors that go into the determination of when a girl menstruates. One is genetic. One factor is genes. We know that different racial groups reach menarche at different ages. On average, girls of African descent have earlier menarches than girls of Caucasian descent, who on average have earlier menarches than girls of Asian descent. Very big generalization, though, because who is purely any one race anymore, right? So we're usually talking about mixtures, and then it becomes very confusing. So part of it's race. But the biggest factor seems to be anything that contributes to the buildup of fat reserves in a girl earlier. And you want to reach the critical 18 to 20% body fat ratio, and then the girl can start menstruating. For healthy menstruation, a woman needs to maintain fat composition somewhere between 18 and about 30% fat. Anything less than that, she'll develop what's called amenarche. She'll stop menstruating. Anything more than that, she could develop amenarche because she may stop ovulating if you have too much body fat. You can get polycystic ovarian syndrome and all sorts of stuff. If I'm piquing your curiosity, look into my human sexuality class. We talk about it in more detail. So part of it has to do, well, most of it has to do with the buildup of fat. Where we start getting into the multifactorial issues is when we start trying to figure out what has caused girls to build up fat earlier than they used to. If you compare the lifestyle of an 1890s American girl, let's say an American girl in 1890 living in Washington versus an American girl living in Washington in 2014, how do their lives differ? One big factor is the amount of exercise that the two girls are getting. On average, a girl in the 1890s walked a lot more, lifted a lot more things, getting water out of the spring, carrying the bucket of milk back from the barn, stuff like that. And she ate a much leaner diet. There were stretches of time when she didn't get any protein from an animal. She got most of it from beans, and plant matter, milk, maybe, cheese. So she was much leaner, and her body fat couldn't build up at the rate that it does today. Girls today don't get the kind of exercise just as a de facto matter of living. Her muscle mass is lower compared to her body fat in modern girls today. Now what we eat, yeah, the hormones in our meat, maybe. But they've looked at different cultures that don't have hormones in their meat. Like in Europe, they have prohibitions against hormones in the meat, and they find the exact same secular trend. So it undermines the interpretation of hormones in the meat and emphasizes more the buildup of fat due to inactivity / better diet. Girls are eating more protein, and that's good for our brains and for building up fat reserves. So it's multifactorial, though. There are a lot of things. And again, I talk about this in more detail in other classes. Spermarchy, now this one's a little trickier. The age at which a boy has his first ejaculation that contains live sperm. Because a lot of guys have absolutely no idea when this occurred. They might have had their first ejaculation while they were sleeping. We call that a wet dream in normal terminology, or nocturnal emission in the scientific lingo. A lot of guys have absolutely no idea what happened except for they woke up with wet sheets. Other guys don't have any idea whether an ejaculation contains live sperm or not. The only way to know for sure if a male is producing sperm is to test his ejaculate or test his blood, because sperm that has been reabsorbed into the body it's detectable in the bloodstream. So we're kind of guessing that as menarche has dropped, probably so has spermarchy. So we're assuming that if girls are at about 12, boys are probably at about 14 these days, but we definitely don't know as well for boys. Which brings up the issue of why we have secondary sexual characteristics. Because other people can't see whether you have had menarche or spermarchy yet, you have been provided with some non-reproductive traits that signal to the outside world that you've reached physical maturity. So we're back to our see-through naked people. If we focus on the woman, you can tell that she's fully developed because she's got fat deposited around her breasts and her hips are wider than her waist. Those are universal signs all around the world that she has reached reproductive capability. Even though you start to develop a little bit of breast buds before you've started menstruating, those are breast buds. Everybody can tell those are not fully mature breasts. In fact, women continue to lay down fat around their breasts into their late teens, and for some women into their 20s. The waist-hip ratio continues to narrow as she grows and develops, and so breasts and hips are a pretty good outward sign that she's reached reproductive capability. For him, it's there's a lot more detail because the action of testosterone changes more things on him. Estrogen protects her from a lot of these changes that he undergoes. So for him, we'll start at the top. His jaw gets heavier than it had been. One of the best ways that you can tell that you're still looking at an emerging adult or a really, like adolescent boy is that his jaw is still not very heavy. And he probably hasn't developed facial hair on the jawline, maybe more around his chin and mustache area, but not onto his jawline yet. That's something that happens as we get older. The larynx, your Adam's apple starts to protrude and your voice drops. Those are outward signs of physical maturity. His shoulders will be wider than his hips. As he builds, it's not all muscle, it's bone structure. His actual bones will get wider in his shoulders while his hips remain the same size that they had been. Plus, for most males who are at all active, his shoulders will develop muscles that hadn't been there before. The action of testosterone will reduce the amount of body fat that he has and increase the amount of muscle mass that he has. So these are outward signs. His broad shoulders, narrow hips, her wider hips, narrow waist. These are just from across the room signs of reproductive capability. All around the world, the waist that narrows on a female is viewed as a sign of fertility and attractiveness. Not all racial groups lay down as much fat around their breast tissue as other racial groups. So breasts are sort of hit or miss as far as whether they are, signs of attractiveness in a culture. But a narrowing waist is viewed as a sign of attractiveness in every culture for women. For men, hips that are narrower than the shoulders are viewed as a sign of attractiveness and maturity in men. Both sexes get hair under their arms and in their pubic area. So that's a universal change that happens with maturity. And then apparently in our modern society, we shave almost all of it off. I just saw a commercial for No-No, and they had a man on it saying, "This is way better than waxing." My husband's like, "Waxing?" Like, you're old. Apparently you're supposed to shave all that stuff off. So yeah, secondary sex characteristics. So these are our outward signs. I want to leave you with one last idea. Don't stop the tape if you want to hear something really interesting. Male and female mammary tissues are exactly the same. If you've ever wondered why men have nipples for these useless breasts, they actually have everything that women have in there. The difference between male and female chests is how much fat is deposited around the female chest. Men don't usually have that. One sidebar, if you smoke marijuana, it will increase the fat around your mammary tissue, men, and give you what's called gynecomastia. So just thought I'd throw that in as a fun aside. But men have the same mammary tissue as women. So if men wanted to, if they became a father and they wanted to nurse their baby alongside their wife, I'll take half the feedings, honey. He could put a breast pump on his nipple and stimulate his nipple like that with the breast pump for 30 minutes at a stretch, 5 times a day, something like that, and within a couple of days he'd start making milk. And it's interesting because it's basically the same chemical composition, except for it contains a little bit more protein than a lactating woman produces. So some people argue that male milk is more nutritive than female milk, which is, I'm not sure. Protein is the key thing in milk for babies. Babies need a lot of fat in their milk. But interesting thing, I always like to tell my students, if you men decide to nurse your babies when and if you have any, please send me an email. I want to hear about it. jseaver@bellevuecollege.edu. All right. Enough on that. I will see you in the next chapter.